Chapter 21 of the Markenmore Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Arrest. A period of tense silence followed on this bold declaration, ended at last by a shuffling of feet and a succession of dry, deprecating coughs. Then a voice came out of the smoke-laden depths of a far corner. "'Tis all very well to say as how this here is a free country," remarked the voice, "but I do allow as 'tain't so free as that a man may call murder agin a woman. That there be what they call libel and slander. What folks goes to assize for. It be a punishable matter that. I count as how you get yourself into sore tribulation, Bill Carver, if so be as you do go up and down, a-sayin' that Mistress Braxfield her did murder at poor young Muster Guy, so you will." "Ain't a-sayin' as how her did murder he," retorted Bill Carver. "What I says is that 'tis my belief as how her did shoot he did. Main different matter. Might ha' been done accidental like." "Oh, if 'twas accidental like, 'tis a vastly different circumstance," said the correcting voice. "There been a deal of serious and bloody murders done accidental, I do allow. But it seems strange if this here catastrophe been brought about, that way. Mistress Braxfield, she say nothing o' that so far." "'Tain't likely as her would," declared Bill Carver. "Her've more sense. Ain't no 'casion as I knows on for any man or woman to go for to accuse theirselves o' terrible doings. Wouldn't be a common sense thing for anybody as that happened to come forward and say as they done it. Ain't Christian conduck for anybody to walk into a trap with his eyes open, I do reckon." "'Tis very true," assented another wiseacre. "No, I don't count as how any well-disposed, law-abiding citizen have any call to criminate hisself. 'Tis agin religion and nature, which is powerful commodities. No, I reckon that if Mistress Braxfield done this, accidental like, with that pistol what Bill Carver referred to, she say to herself, 'Well,' she say, 'this here is a sad misfortune to happen to me, but I ain't no call to tell about it,' she say, and then, of course, she say nothing. That be the way of it, common sense like. And we all knows that accidents does happen to the meekest of us." "Accident'll happen to I, if I don't get home along," remarked Bill Carver with a laugh, as he rose from his corner and made for the door. "My old woman she do have supper ready 9 o'clock Sunday nights, and if I ain't to the minute, she'll let me hear the sound of her tongue. I bid ye all a good night." He strode out amidst a chorus of farewells, but stopped in the hall, pulled up by a tap on his arm, and turned to find Blick at his elbow. "A word with you," said Blick. "Come in here." He led Carver into his sitting room and closed the door. "You know what I am, Carver," he went on in a low voice. "A detective. Very well. Now, I heard what you said in there. Is it true that you've seen Mrs. Braxfield shooting at things with a pistol early of a morning?" "True enough, master," replied Carver. "I seen her do that more than once. Been working up in they woods all this winter and spring, I have, and gone to my work uncommon early since the mornings got light. I seen Mistress Braxfield out about her house now and again, taking a pop at they foxes. There's a wealth of them varmints up there, and I did hear her say as they was a ways at her chickens. Oh, I seen her with her pistol." "You didn't see her last Tuesday morning? The morning Mr. Guy was shot?" "I didn't, master, 'cause I wasn't in them parts at all that day. I was over t'other side of Grey Closter,
2 miles off." He paused, regarding the detective with knowing eyes. "Don't want to make no trouble, master," he went on suddenly, "but I could have said a deal more in there than what I did say." "What?" demanded Blick. "If you know anything, tell it." "Don't know anything particular," said Carver, "but I said in there, accidental. Nor there is them in the village what says, on purpose."
"Do you mean that there are people in Markenmore who are saying that Mrs. Braxfield meant to shoot Mr. Guy?" asked Blick. "Is that it?" "That's it, master," replied Carver. "They are saying it, some of 'em round about where I lives, on one Mightbourne Road, but only since it come out that Mistress Braxfield's lass, young Poppy, be wed to Master Harry. When that comes out, the folk begin to talk same as I do tell ye. 'Ah,' says they, 'that be the true color of it. Her shooted Master Guy so his poor brother could be Sir Harry, and that young damsel be my Lady Markenmore. So 'tis said they. Ain't no doubt on it. But you'll bear in mind, master, as how I don't say that. I do say her, very like, shooted him accidental." Blick paid no attention to Carver's personal opinion. He was thinking of the common gossip. "Are many of them saying that?" he asked. "Your neighbors, I mean?" "All of 'em's a saying it," declared Carver. "Down our way, you understand, far into the village. Them here chaps what you sees out of the bar there, they belong to this end of the place. Us don't know what they'm thinking, but down along with us, that be the general talk. Her shooted Master Guy, so Master Harry un be Sir Harry, and the young gal un be my lady. See, master?" He paused again, and again gave the detective a shrewd, knowing look. "Her's a sharp, spry female, Mistress Braxfield," he continued suddenly. "I could tell ye more nor that, only I ain't one for to get nobody into trouble, but so I could." "If you know anything, you ought to tell it," said Blick. "What do you mean, now, about Mrs. Braxfield?" "Well, master, I tells ye," said Carver, after a pause. "Maybe you didn't see but I was up at that crowner's quest what they held at the court. Mistress Braxfield, her wented into the witness box and gived evidence. Her said as how her seed Master Harborough at a certain place on the hillside from her chamber window, at a certain time that Tuesday morning. Master, her didn't do nothing of that sort. Her couldn't see that place from her chamber window. 'Tis impossible. I did help to build that there house of hers, Woodland Cottage, and from her chamber window you couldn't see that place where she said she did see Master John. But her could have seen it and him, or whoever was there from somewhere else, where very like her was." "Where?" demanded Blick. "Bit of a spinney right against Markenmore Hollow," answered Carver, "where I seen her more than once a-looking out for they foxes." Blick suddenly remembered his big ordnance survey map still pinned against the wall. He led Carver over to it and pointed out certain landmarks. "I seen a drawing like this afore, master," said Carver. "Old Muster Tompkins to Beach Farm, he have one of them here, framed in his parlor. Many's the time I've studied he when I been waiting there for the old gentleman to give me my orders. And I'll show ye what I do mean about what I say." He pulled out a wooden match from his pocket and proceeded to point out places and trace lines on the map before him. "Now here be Woodland Cottage, master, so plain written as never was, and there be the spot where Mistress Braxfield do say she see Muster Harborough. But as you see, between them two places there be a rise of a bit of a hill. Her couldn't see through that, nohow, could her? No. But now you comes along here, as it med be, from her house across the hillside to this here bit of spinney on the edge of Markenmore Hollow, and you sees that from that her could see, straight down to the place where she said she see Mr. Harborough. 'Tis all visible, so to speak, from that. There med be no doubt her did see Mr. Harborough at that particular spot that morning, but her didn't see him from her chamber window, 'cause her couldn't. If her seed him at all, her seed him from that spinney where I assures ye I see her more than once popping at they foxes." "Did you ever see the pistol she used?" asked Blick. He was certain by then that at last he had got on a definite trail, and he felt that he might as well pursue it. "Seen it in her hand time and again," replied Carver. Blick suddenly produced the automatic pistol and held it out to his companion. "Was that it?" he asked. Carver looked down at the exhibit with a flash of curiosity. "Well," he exclaimed, "if 'tain't, 'tis the very spittin' image of that there what I sees her handle. But they things be pretty much of a muchness, I reckon, master." Blick put the automatic pistol back in his pocket and laid his hand on Carver's arm. "Now look here," he said, "just you keep all this to yourself. There's a good man. Don't say a word about it to anybody, not even to your wife. I hope you won't get into trouble by being late for your supper, but silence now, not a word." "I understand ye, master," responded Carver with a knowing grin. "And I 'ont go for to breathe a syllable till you tells I 'tis convenient. Howsomever, do ye remember, master, as how what I says is, accidental it med be, ain't no sort of hands at shooting off guns and pistols. Isn't women, as you knows." When Carver had departed into the night, Blick walked up and down his sitting room for a good 10 minutes, thinking. At the end of that time he went up to his bedroom, got into an overcoat, and made ready for going out. Descending to the hall, he encountered Grimsdale just entering the house. "Late walk, Mr. Blick?" asked the landlord with a smile. "Fine night, too." "I'm going into Cellcaster," replied Blick. "And look here, I don't think I shall be back tonight. I shall stay the night at the Mitre. You'll see me sometime tomorrow morning." Grimsdale nodded in acquiescence and led his guest out, and Blick went away along the starlit road towards Cellcaster, still thinking, speculating, putting things together, and all his thoughts and speculations came to a point in Mrs. Braxfield. Mrs. Braxfield was in her tidy kitchen next morning at 8:30 o'clock, giving orders to the charwoman who always came to Woodland Cottage on Mondays, when a knock sounded on her front door. She opened the door herself and confronted Blick, the chief constable, and another man in plain clothes, but obviously a policeman. The 3 men, all watching her keenly, saw her start, frown, and turn pale. But they affected to notice nothing unusual, and the chief constable's voice, addressing her, was polite and cheery. "Good morning, Mrs. Braxfield," he said. "Just called to have a little chat with you, madam. May we come in?" Mrs. Braxfield turned back into the hall, and opening a door, motioned her visitors into the room in which Blick had listened to Mr. Franzen Mary's story 3 nights previously. The plainclothesman, entering last, carefully closed the door and remained standing before it. "What do you want?" demanded Mrs. Braxfield. The color had come back to her cheeks, and she was looking decidedly angry. Anger, too, was apparent in her voice. "We want to have a talk to you about last Tuesday morning, Mrs. Braxfield," replied the chief constable. "Just a quiet talk, between ourselves." "I'm not so sure about that 'between ourselves,'" exclaimed Mrs. Braxfield with unmistakable asperity. "It strikes me that some folk, when they say 'between ourselves,' mean a good deal of the very opposite. I believe some of you," here she gave Blick an indignant glance, "some of you have been talking about me behind my back. Here's my charwoman just come up from the village, and she said there's talk going on down there about me and the murder. Nay, there's more. They sayin' some of them that I had something to do with it. Did it myself. Some of them are saying straight out. Now where's all that originated, I should like to know. But I'll find out, and then I'll see what my lawyer has to say." "Quite so, Mrs. Braxfield," agreed the chief constable. "You'll be quite within your rights to do that if false rumors are being spread about you. But we've heard of these rumors, and we want to ask a few questions. I'm sure you'll see that it will be advisable for you to answer them. Eh, Mrs. Braxfield?" "Depends what they are," replied Mrs. Braxfield, still angry. "I shall please myself." "Well, the first thing is this," continued the chief constable, becoming somewhat sterner in manner. "I'm afraid you didn't tell the exact truth at the inquest the other day. You said that you saw Mr. John Harborough at a certain spot on the hillside from your chamber window, your bedroom window. Now, Mrs. Braxfield, you couldn't see him at that place from your bedroom window. There's a rise of a hill between your house and that particular place. What have you to say to that?" Mrs. Braxfield had paled again, and started visibly at this, and her lips compressed themselves for an instant. "I did see him all the same," she said sullenly. "I might get mixed up about exactly where it was from, but—" "Now, where was it from?" asked the chief constable. "Come, you can't have forgotten that, an important matter." But Mrs. Braxfield's lips again compressed themselves, and in the middle of her pale cheeks red, angry spots began to show. "If you won't speak, I'll refresh your memory," said the chief constable. "Wasn't it from the edge of that little spinney near Markenmore Hollow? Come now." "What if it was?" retorted Mrs. Braxfield. "What were you doing there at that time of the morning?" asked the chief constable. "That's my business," said Mrs. Braxfield with sudden defiance. "What have you to do with it?" The chief constable shook his head. "Oh, well," he answered, "if you're going to adopt that tone, Mrs. Braxfield, we must show our hand a little more openly. Now, Mrs. Braxfield, listen to me. We know certain things. You've been in the habit of going to that spinney or round about it very early of a morning to have a shot at foxes. The foxes, we hear, have given you trouble about your fowls. Is that so?" "What if it is?" demanded Mrs. Braxfield. "Do you think I'm going to have my valuable fowls and chickens carried off by foxes? I'm not. Not for all the hunting men in the country. So there! I wish I could shoot every fox that's running about. As it is, all I've done has been to frighten them." "You can settle your affairs about the foxes with the master of foxhounds, Mrs. Braxfield," said the chief constable good-humoredly. "It's a truly awful crime to shoot a fox, in the opinion of hunting people, but it's one that doesn't come within police regulations. But now, Mrs. Braxfield, what did you use in shooting at the foxes? Was it a rifle, or a sporting gun, or a revolver, or was it an automatic pistol? Come." Mrs. Braxfield looked from one face to another. 3 pairs of eyes were fixed firmly upon her. "Who's been telling you all this?" she suddenly exclaimed. "Who's been—" "It was an automatic pistol, wasn't it?" persisted the chief constable. "Come now, Mrs. Braxfield, why not answer straight out?" "What if it was?" muttered Mrs. Braxfield. "Then it was. Very well. Now then," continued the chief constable, "where did you get it?" Mrs. Braxfield, who until then had been standing by the table in the center of the room, facing her 3 visitors, suddenly sat down in the nearest chair, folded her hands on her lap, looked calmly from one to the other. "Look here," she said quietly, finally fixing her eyes on the chief constable. "You no doubt think you're being very plain and outspoken and all that, but if you want any information out of me, you'll have to be a good deal plainer. And I'll tell you straight out that you're not going to get me to incriminate myself. I haven't said that I had any automatic pistol. You said, 'Was it an automatic pistol that I used to scare the foxes?' I replied, 'What if it was?' That isn't saying that it was, or that I ever had one. I'm willing to give any information that I can, but you're treating me with suspicion, and I'm not going to be forced into any admission that might be damaging. Damaging to me and to others, very likely. You treat me fair and—" "Mrs. Braxfield," broke in the chief constable, "we've no wish for anything else than to treat you fairly, but we know certain things, and we're bound to ask you for some explanation. Now, as you ask me to be more explicit, I will. I may as well tell you that an automatic pistol has been found." The chief constable stopped suddenly. Mrs. Braxfield, taken unawares, had turned pale to the lips, and her hands tightened. She started palpably. "Found?" she exclaimed. "Found, Mrs. Braxfield," said the chief constable sternly. "I needn't ask you if you have any idea as to where it was found. I think you have. Now that automatic pistol has, of course, a mark and a number, and it has been identified by a gunsmith in Cellcaster as one that he sold, comparatively recently, to Mr. Harry Markenmore, your son-in-law. Now, Mrs. Braxfield, we know beyond any question that you have been in the habit of using an automatic pistol of that particular sort to scare or shoot foxes. Be candid. Was the pistol that you've been using given to you by Mr. Harry Markenmore? The pistol that is now in our possession? Come!" Mrs. Braxfield sat silent for a while. Now and then she looked at her questioner. Now and then at the rings on her fingers, which she was mechanically turning round and round. It seemed a long time before she spoke, but when she did, it was to the accompaniment of an unusual dogged and defiant look. "I'm not going to say another word," she said. "Bear you in mind, all of you, that I've admitted nothing." The chief constable glanced at Blick and sighed. The sigh of a man upon whom an unpleasant duty is forced, much against his will. "Very well, Mrs. Braxfield," he said quietly. "Then there's nothing else for it. You'll have to come with us." "Do you mean that you're going to take me to Cellcaster?" asked Mrs. Braxfield with suspicious calmness. "All right, and you'll be more than sorry for it, as you'll see. Very well, I suppose I can go upstairs and make ready." "No," said the chief constable, "not out of my sight now. You've a woman in the house. You can ring for her and tell her to get all you want. Then, we've a cab outside." "Ah," remarked Mrs. Braxfield maliciously, "you're only doing what you meant to do. All right, Mr. Chief Constable, and the other two of you, you'll be sorry for this." But the chief constable silently motioned to Blick to ring the bell for the charwoman. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of the Markenmore Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mrs. Braxfield's move. 5 minutes later, the charwoman, amazed and lachrymose, and holding a corner of her apron in readiness to apply to her eyes, watched the little procession move away across the garden of Woodland Cottage and over the hillside to the edge of the grass track, whereat the cab was in waiting. She kept her eyes fixed on Mrs. Braxfield until Mrs. Braxfield vanished. But Mrs. Braxfield never looked back. Her eyes were concentrated on the cab in which she was to be carried away. There were two more plainclothesmen in charge of it, one on the box, another by the door, and at sight of them she laughed satirically. "You came pretty well prepared, I think," she said with bitter emphasis. "I can see what was in your minds. This is what you call having a talk between ourselves? Being frank and candid? And all that rubbish." "You've only got to be candid, Mrs. Braxfield, and there'd be no necessity to take you away," said the chief constable. "If you'd only just tell me—" "I shall tell nothing," retorted Mrs. Braxfield. "Nothing at all. Not one word. Until I've seen my solicitor, Mr. Crewe. I suppose you'll not deny me the right of seeing him when I get to wherever you're going to take me." "You shall see Mr. Crewe within 10 minutes of reaching Cellcaster," assented the chief constable. "I'll give orders to that effect. My men here will see that you're quite comfortable, and that you and Mr. Crewe have every facility you want. And I hope, Mrs. Braxfield, for your own sake, that by the time I get back to Cellcaster, you'll have thought better of things and been more open and candid with your solicitor than you've been with me." "That's my business," said Mrs. Braxfield. "I can do it without any advice from you. But aren't you going back now? Mr. Crewe'll want you." "Not at present," said the chief constable. "You'll go with my men. Mr. Blick and myself are now going to see Mr. Harry Markenmore." Mrs. Braxfield stopped in her progress towards the cab. A curious look came into her eyes. You're not going to arrest him," she whispered. "Just leave us to manage our own business, if you please, Mrs. Braxfield," said the chief constable. "Step in. You'll be treated with every consideration, as you'll see. Marshall," he continued, turning to the man who had accompanied Blick and himself to the cottage, "as soon as you get to Cellcaster, put Mrs. Braxfield in my room and send Robinson at once to Mr. Crewe, asking him to come round immediately to see her. You know all the rest. I shall be back there as quickly as possible." The cab drove away with its burden of 3 stolid-faced men and a highly indignant woman, and the chief constable took off his peaked and laced cap and wiped his forehead. "Whew!" he said. "Disagreeable business that, Blick. Now why the deuce couldn't that foolish woman be candid instead of behaving in a fashion calculated to arouse suspicion? A few words, a proper explanation, and we needn't have been put to this trouble." "She's a determined and obstinate woman," answered Blick, reflectively. "But as far as I'm concerned, no amount of explanation would have satisfied me. I haven't the slightest doubt that it was she who threw this automatic pistol away down the badger hole. And if that isn't damaging to her, I don't know what is." "You think it's highly probable that she shot Guy Markenmore, then?" suggested the chief constable. "Well, if you want to know, I do," declared Blick, frankly. "It was probably done on the spur of the moment, but I think she did. From what I've seen of her, I think she's a woman who wouldn't stick at anything. She's evidently tremendously ambitious about that daughter of hers, and was very keen that she should be Lady Markenmore instead of merely Mrs. Harry. Franza Mary can tell you that Mrs. Braxfield was terribly upset when she found that Guy had left a son, and that Harry hadn't succeeded to the baronetcy. Whatever may result, there's very strong ground of suspicion against her. She wouldn't be the first woman who's resorted to murder for the sake of family advancement. Not she. I wonder what made her start when I mentioned that we were going to see Harry Markenmore," remarked the chief constable. "And whatever made her ask if we were meaning to arrest him? Surely, if she was in it, he isn't. Can't have been an accessory." "Can't say," answered Blick, laconically. "But she was taken aback." However, there is Harry Markenmore. We needn't go to the house for him." He and his companion had crossed Deep Lane by that time, and now were traversing the park in the direction of Markenmore Court. And there, a little way before them, they saw Harry Markenmore superintending the labors of 3 or 4 men who were engaged in felling a giant elm tree. He caught sight of them at the same moment and presently came strolling in their direction, his eyes looking a question as they met. "Good morning, Mr. Markenmore," began the chief constable. "We were just going to the house to see you. The fact is," he continued, unconsciously lowering his voice in spite of the fact that he and his 2 companions stood in a solitude, "a very unpleasant situation has arisen in respect of the death of your brother. Now, Mr. Markenmore, you can help us to clear it up, one way or another, if you'll give us some information. The whole thing may be capable of very easy explanation. Anyway, I'm sure you'll help us if you can." "In what way?" asked Harry. He stood, hands in pockets, glancing first at one, then at the other. In Blick's opinion, he seemed to be ill at ease. "What do you want to know?" "Well, first of all," replied the chief constable quietly, "we better tell you what we do know. Now, don't be alarmed or upset, Mr. Markenmore, by what I have to say." A queer expression suddenly played about Harry Markenmore's lips, and he gave Blick an equally queer glance. "Why should I be either alarmed or upset?" he asked. "Scarcely likely." "Just so, Mr. Markenmore, just so," agreed the chief constable. "It isn't at all likely, but you know what I mean. Well, now, in the course of his inquiries, Detective Sergeant Blick has found that some little time ago you purchased a Webley Fosbury automatic pistol at Whittington's the gunsmith in Salcaster. That's so, Mr. Markenmore?" "That is so, certainly," replied Harry. "No secret about it, either." "I felt sure there wouldn't be," said the chief constable. "Very well. Would you recognize that pistol if you were shown it?" "By its mark and number, yes," answered Harry. The chief constable turned to Blick, who promptly drew the automatic pistol from his pocket and handed it over. Both watched curiously as Harry examined it. "That's it," he said. "But how—" "Mr. Markenmore," interrupted the chief constable, "this is where the unpleasant part of the business comes in. That pistol was found, by Detective Sergeant Blick himself, thrown away in a hole, a badger hole, behind the bushes in Deep Lane there, last Friday evening. Now, Mr. Markenmore, have you any idea how your pistol came to be there? For it is the automatic pistol you bought at Whittington's. We've identified the number and mark." Harry Markenmore, healthy enough in color until then, had paled, and he was staring at the automatic pistol with a frown that was half angry and half puzzled. He exclaimed. "How should I know how it came there?" "But you'll know what you did with the pistol when you bought it, Mr. Markenmore," said the chief constable. "I gather from your last remark that it passed out of your possession. Now, Mr. Markenmore, be frank with us. To whom did you give the pistol? Or to whom did you lend it? Anyway, who's had it?" Harry Markenmore handed the pistol back and replaced his hands in his pockets. "Look here," he said quietly, "you'd better be frank, too. Are you suggesting that it was a shot from that thing that caused my brother's death?" "We think it extremely probable, Mr. Markenmore," answered the chief constable. "We showed it to the police surgeon last night, and in his opinion it is just the sort of thing that was used." "And whom do you suspect of using it?" demanded Harry. "Come now." He had assumed the role of examiner then, and he was watching the 2 men as keenly as they had watched him.
The chief constable hesitated. "I should prefer that you tell us what you did with the pistol," he began. "And I prefer that you tell me whom you suspect of using it on my brother," declared Harry. "Whatever you prefer, I'm not going to say anything that may incriminate perfectly innocent people. That's flat and final, too." The chief constable looked at Blick, and Blick, who was beginning to size matters up, nodded. "Tell him," he murmured. "Very well, Mr. Markenmore," said the chief constable. "I'll take the lead. We believe there is ground of suspicion against Mrs. Braxfield. We have found out that for some time she has been in the habit of firing an automatic pistol near a spinney on the edge of Markenmore Hollow in order to frighten foxes away from her chickens, and that she has often been seen there at very early hours of the morning. Now, Mr. Markenmore, is yours the pistol she used?" "What does Mrs. Braxfield herself say?" asked Harry quietly. "Mrs. Braxfield refuses to say anything," answered the chief constable, "except that she admits firing at the foxes sometimes at the times and place I've mentioned. And the result is that we've been obligated to take her off to Selcaster pending inquiries." Harry Markenmore's face suddenly became dark with anger. "What?" he exclaimed. "You've arrested her?" "Detained for further inquiries," said the chief constable, with a sudden approach to stern formalities. "She has only to give us a satisfactory explanation." "Damnation!" Harry Markenmore suddenly burst out. "Are you aware that Mrs. Braxfield is my mother-in-law? What the devil do you mean by even suggesting that she murdered my brother?" "Be calm, Mr. Markenmore," said the chief constable. "Help us to clear up this affair of the automatic pistol. Tell us if and why you gave it to Mrs. Braxfield, and if you can account for its being thrown away. Then—" But Harry, muttering angrily to himself, suddenly turned and strode off rapidly in the direction of Markenmore Court, and though the chief constable called to him, begging him to listen to reason, he marched on without taking further notice. The two men looked at each other. "Is he to go?" asked Blick. "What can we do?" answered the chief constable. "Hang it all! I think I should have insisted on his going with us to Selcaster," said Blick. "If he and Mrs. Braxfield had been confronted—" The chief constable, however, had turned towards the village. "Oh, well," he said, "there's a way of making him speak. He'll have to speak of his part in a witness box. Let's get to Selcaster, and if that woman hasn't come to her senses under Crewe's advice, I'll charge her formally and bring her before the magistrates. They'll be sitting at 11 o'clock this morning." "You'll go as far as that?" said Blick. "I will," declared the chief constable. "I shall be justified on what we know already. Come on, we'll get a trap at the Scepter." Half an hour later, when he and Blick drove up to the police station, they met Crewe, the solicitor, emerging from it. He gave the chief constable a dry, shrewd smile. He said, drawing himself aside. "Pretty arbitrary in your treatment of Mrs. B, I think. However, under my advice, she'll now tell you what you wanted to know, and after that, if I were you, I should just let her go quietly home. She's pretty furious, and she's given me certain instructions that'll probably help you, though between you and me, I think she's a fool for doing it." "I don't understand you," said the chief constable curtly. Crewe waved a sheet of paper which he carried towards the police station. "Go in and see her then," he retorted. The chief constable motioned Blick to follow him to his room. One of the plainclothesmen stood outside. Inside sat Mrs. Braxfield, conversing amicably with the other two, who at a sign from their superior went out. "Well, Mrs. Braxfield," said the chief constable as he seated himself at his desk, We've just seen your solicitor, and he tells me you are now going to give me the information I wanted. But I may as well tell you I'm a bit tired of this, and I want straightforward answers to my questions. Now then, is that automatic pistol that you've been using to scare the foxes with one that was given to you by Mr. Harry Markenmore?" "Yes," answered Mrs. Braxfield sullenly. "For what purpose did he give it to you?" "Well, it was some time after he became engaged with my consent to my daughter. He used, of course, to come up to Woodland Cottage and see us in the evenings, and he often said what a lonely situation it was for two women, for Braxfield rarely came then. And one day he brought that pistol, and showed us both how to use it. And when those foxes began raiding my fowls, I thought of the pistol and used it to scare them. I never hit one that I know of." "Where is the pistol?" demanded the chief constable. "Well," replied Mrs. Braxfield with obvious reluctance, "I've been a fool about that. After I heard of Guy Markenmore's murder, I got nervous, frightened. I thought there might be a search made. You never know. And it would look queer for me to have a pistol. And so, well, I threw it away." "Where?" "Down a deep hole behind the bushes in the lane near my house," said Mrs. Braxfield. "One more question," said the chief constable. "Did you see Guy Markenmore at all anywhere last Tuesday morning? And did you fire that pistol that morning?" "No," declared Mrs. Braxfield. "I never saw Guy Markenmore. Have never seen him for 7 years. And I never fired the pistol that morning. I hadn't it with me." The chief constable took Blick aside, and for some minutes they talked together in low tones. At last the chief constable turned round. "Well, Mrs. Braxfield," he said, "I won't detain you any longer. You've only yourself to thank for your being brought here. You can go now." Mrs. Braxfield got up from her chair with dignity. "I am going," she said, "and it would be a bad job for anybody who kept me any longer. Just as it'll be a bad job for anybody who spreads any more rumors about me. But I've adopted a course that'll surprise some of you, and you police folk may as well know what it is. It's something that ought to have been done before. I've instructed Crewe to get out at once this very morning a bill offering a substantial reward to anybody who gives information that'll lead to the arrest and conviction of Guy Markenmore's murderer. If you police had had half your wits about you, you'd have done that long since. Lord bless you, do you think there aren't folk in Markenmore who know something? Why, there isn't a soul in the place that wouldn't give his or her own mother away for a 5-pound note. And I'm not short of 5-pound notes, I can tell you. I could buy all Markenmore up if I wanted." "Good morning, Mrs. Braxfield," said the chief constable. Then, remembering that Mrs. Braxfield had come there against her will, he added politely, "Will you have a cab to drive home in? I'll order one at once." "Thank you. I can order cabs for myself, and pay for them, too," said Mrs. Braxfield as she sailed out. "I want no favors." The chief constable sighed when Mrs. Braxfield had gone. "I dare say that's the real truth, at least, about the automatic pistol," he remarked. "Why couldn't Harry Markenmore tell us?" "I don't suppose that he knew that she threw it away," answered Blick. He was walking up and down the room, evidently restless and dissatisfied. Finally he brought up at a window overlooking the street. "Here's Harry Markenmore himself, with Chilford," he exclaimed suddenly. "He must have ridden in as soon as he left us in the park. They've met Mrs. Braxfield now, and she's giving them the benefit of her tongue, I think." "Let her," said the chief constable. "I'm sick of her." "I'm not satisfied about her and Harry Markenmore and that pistol," observed Blick. "After all, we've only got her word for what she alleges, and we haven't got his at all. If he gave her the pistol for the very innocent reason she spoke of, to keep in the house as a means of protection, why couldn't he say so straight out, without all that mystery and losing his temper into the bargain? Not very satisfactory. I suppose he was angry because Mrs. Braxfield is his mother-in-law, and he'll have to tell his wife of what we appeared to suspect, remarked the chief constable. Not a very nice situation for a young woman who's come into a family under odd circumstances. I don't think I should have liked it, had I been Harry Markenmore, to have to go and say to my young wife, "Look here, the police have collared your mother on suspicion of murdering my brother. Would you?" So I can excuse his temper. Blick made no reply. He continued staring out of the window in silence for some time. Suddenly he spoke. "Chilford's coming across here," he said. "Those two have been jawing at him no end." Chilford came in presently and shook his head at the two men with mock reproof. I say," he said. "Rather high-handed proceedings, eh? To collar Mrs. Braxfield like that, after trying to get her to incriminate herself. Come, you don't really mean to tell me, either of you, that you think it at all likely that Mrs. Braxfield would be such a fool as to murder a man to whom she'd just become related by marriage? A Markenmore, too? Really, I'm surprised." "Look you here, Chilford," interrupted the chief constable, getting a little red about the ears. "You can be as surprised as you like. Mrs. Braxfield has only herself to blame, and she's only gone out of here on sufferance. Let her be thankful if we don't fetch her back and keep her." Chilford pulled himself together, staring. "Oh," he said. "Oh, very well, if you're putting it that way. I've no more to say, except that Crewe and I will put our heads together on behalf of the family. We're not at all satisfied with you police. You're not going on the right track. Why don't you recognize once and for all that the real reason for Guy Markenmore's murder was money? Money in some fashion or another. Money!" With another emphatic repetition of his last word, he swung round and left the room. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of the Markenmore Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Professorial Theory. The chief constable looked at Blick when Chilford walked out. His eyes assumed a somewhat blank and doubtful expression. "What on earth does he mean by all that?" he exclaimed. "That something to do with money is at the bottom of it," said Blick. "And after all, there's the £3,000 worth of banknotes to account for. There doesn't seem any doubt that Guy Markenmore had these notes on him when he left for the Scepter, and he certainly hadn't them when we examined his clothing. Where are they? Obviously, the murderer helped himself to them." The chief constable reflected a while. "The queer thing to my way of thinking," he observed at last, "is this. If the murder was committed for the sake of robbery, how comes it that the murderer didn't possess himself of all the rest of the stuff Guy Markenmore had on him? Money, a fair lot, I think. Valuables, gold watch and chain, and so on. There was a very valuable diamond ring, wasn't there? The odd thing is that another ring, the duplicate of that which Mrs. Tretherick wears, was gone," said Blick. "Gone! A comparatively valueless thing, merely a curiosity, while a diamond ring, worth a great deal, was left on the very same finger. But what's the use of theorizing? The facts are as they are. If there's nothing whatever in what we'll call the Mrs. Braxfield line, well, I'm still without any real clue." "Chilford says money, money, money," remarked the chief constable.
I wish we knew more of Guy Markenmore's money affairs. But talking of money, I shouldn't wonder if that dodge of Mother Braxfield's mayn't have something in it. I know village people pretty well by now. What she said is quite true. There's scarce a soul amongst 'em that wouldn't sell his own mother for a 5-pound note. Bit exaggerated, of course, that, but it's sound in principle." Blick looked doubtful and surprised. "Do you mean to say that, supposing there are people in Markenmore who really do know something about this affair, they've kept silent up to now?" he asked. "I don't mean people who might be incriminated by confession or revelation, but people who are in possession of information and simply won't give it." "Nothing more likely," affirmed the chief constable, with the emphatic assurance of experience. "Village folk are the biggest gossips and scandal-mongers under the sun. There isn't a village in England that isn't a perfect hotbed of slander, born of envy, hatred, malice, and all uncharitableness. But don't you make any mistake, my lad, village folk, in spite of that tendency, can be as close as ever they make 'em. You might as well try to get butter out of a dog's mouth as try to extract a secret from them if they don't want to tell it." "Why, I would give you piles of proof of that out of my own experience. I remember one case that happened near here not so long ago. A certain land agent was shot at and badly wounded one night as he went home, and we've never yet found out who his assailant and would-be murderer was. But I haven't the slightest doubt that nearly every man and woman in that place knows who he was. Only they won't say, because their chief regret is that the victim wasn't finished off. There you are." "But according to Mrs. Braxfield, and you seem to agree with her, these folks would tell for a 5-pound note," said Blick, with a cynical laugh. "Why didn't you try that in the case you mention?" "We may do yet," replied the chief constable. "The victim himself seems inclined to hush the matter up, fearing worse things, but we may try a reward. In this Markenmore affair, however, Mrs. Braxfield is going to try a monetary offer, out of pure pique, I fancy, and it won't surprise me if something results. If I were you, Blick, I should keep my ears on the stretch during the next 24 hours. I don't know what she'll offer, but if it's something substantial, there'll be a vast amount of cupidity aroused amongst these rustics. I know 'em." Blick got up from the elbow chair in which, since Chilford's abrupt departure, he had been sitting with his legs stretched out and his hands in his pockets, looking perplexed and somewhat disconsolate. "I may as well be going back then," he muttered. "Hanged if I know even now, if we didn't part with Mrs. Braxfield a bit too easily." "She'll not run away," retorted the chief constable, with a significant nod of his head. "And if it's all a piece of bluff—" He paused as a policeman entered the room and laid a card before him. "The gentleman's waiting outside, sir," said the policeman. The chief constable glanced at the card, started, and turned to Blick. "Sir Thomas Hodges Wilkins," he murmured surprisedly. "That big scientific chap. Professor from Cambridge that fellow Spindler told us about. What on earth can he want? Bring him in, Jarvis," he went on. "Set a chair there." He looked wonderingly at the detective. "Another development," he muttered. "What now?" Blick made no reply. He was watching the door, through which suddenly appeared a man who was not at all the sort of person that Blick expected to see. Instead of being old and grave and bald and bearded and spectacled and dressed anyhow, the famous professor of chemistry was a smart, alert, rather military-looking man, fastidiously attired, wearing a monocle instead of spectacles, and endowed with a breezy air and a cheery smile, which he bestowed freely on the two occupants of the room as he marched in and seated himself by the chief constable's desk, on the edge of which he laid down 2 or 3 newspapers, heavily marked here and there with blue pencil. Good morning, he exclaimed. I don't know whether you'll guess my business from my name, or indeed if you know anything about it. But I've been reading the newspaper accounts of this Markenmore affair, and it seemed to me last night that it was my duty to come here and tell you something. And first of all, to make things clear, have you had here a young man named Spindler, a chemist's assistant from Farmsham?" "We have," replied the chief constable. "Did he tell you anything in which my name came up? And if so, what?" "He told us, this is Detective Sergeant Blick, who was with me when this man Spindler called, that a certain secret of his, respecting the preparation of some dye which he had offered to sell Guy Markenmore, was submitted to you by Markenmore for your expert opinion." "Just so. It was. Markenmore got my opinion. Now, how much further had that gone?" "Gone to this," answered the chief constable. "When Markenmore was murdered he had on him £3,000 in banknotes, which we believe he was to hand over to Spindler that very morning in payment for his secret." "Spindler was going to sell for £3,000? "He was, so he told us." The professor of chemistry screwed his monocle still further into the cavity of his eye and took a queer, keenly inspecting glance at the 2 men. "Do you 2 believe, are you theorizing that Markenmore was murdered for £3,000? he asked quizzically. "It, to be sure, looks rather obvious." "There is such a theory afloat," answered the chief constable. "He had that sum on him at 3 o'clock on Tuesday morning, and it was gone when his dead body was found a very few hours later." "Aye," said the professor with a short laugh, "and something else gone with it, too. Now look here, I'm not a policeman, but I have some intelligence. I'll tell you what Guy Markenmore was murdered for, and I'll lay all the money I've got to a China orange that I'm right, all the time. Guy Markenmore was murdered for the Spindler formula. Dead certain." The professor laughed again and slapped his elegantly gloved hand on the desk at his side. The 2 listeners stared at him, and then at each other, and this time it was Blick who spoke. "Are we to understand, Sir Thomas," he asked, that formula was of great value? Of greater value than the £3,000? "Call me professor," said the famous scientist. "Saves time. Yes, you are to understand that. £3,000. Had it been my secret, I wouldn't have sold it for £30,000. That chap Spindler is an ass, or awfully ignorant of market values. Had he stuck to it himself, he'd have made a huge fortune out of it, one way or another. I don't know if you 2 are at all up in this question of aniline dyes. You know at any rate, if you read your newspapers, that it's a most serious question. One of rescuing a trade originally ours from its German usurpers. You know that? Very well, this young man at Farsham, clever chap indeed, has discovered a peculiar formula. I needn't go into details, but I know enough to be absolutely certain, in my own mind, that Markenmore was murdered by somebody who knew he had the formula on him, and who meant to have it for himself by hook or crook. He was probably followed down here, watched, and attacked at the lonely spot I read of in the papers." "That presupposes that somebody in London knew what he had on him," said Blick. "Somebody, in London or elsewhere, certainly must have known," assented the professor. "My own theory is that Markenmore told other people, financial speculators perhaps, about this, and he may have shown them my opinion as an expert. But I'll tell you my own share in the transaction. I have, as you may know, a European reputation as a chemist. Well,
Markenmore wrote to me, enclosing Spindler's formula and a handsome fee, asking me to tell him what I thought of it. I recognized the immense value of the thing at once, and I wrote out my opinion and returned the formula with it to Markenmore. I was so anxious that the secret of the formula should be kept that I adopted unusual precautions in sending the papers, which no living soul but myself has seen while they were in my possession, to him. Instead of posting them, I gave them, heavily sealed, to a trusted assistant of mine.
An assistant in my laboratory, who was just then going to London for a holiday, so that they might be delivered to Markenmore himself by hand at his office in Fulgrave Court. That they were so delivered, I know. The assistant to whom I have referred, though he did not know what precisely the packet contained, knew that its contents were of supreme consequence, and, indeed, of monetary value, and he was most careful to hand the packet to Markenmore in person. And when Markenmore came down here that night, he would have had these papers on him, the formula itself and my opinion on it. I tell you again, my belief is that he let somebody else into the secret, that somebody followed him, watched him, and murdered him. The Spindler formula is at the bottom of the whole thing." A period of silence followed, during which the three men looked at each other. The professor broke it at last with a direct question. "You've no clue so far?" "None," answered Blick. "You'll have to hark back," said the professor. "London. Get at some of Markenmore's recent doings there. Now, as I came through London from Cambridge yesterday, I made it in my way to call at Markenmore's office in Fulgrave Court to make a few inquiries. Markenmore's head clerk gave me some information. He remembered my assistant, Mr. Carter, calling. He himself saw Carter deliver to Markenmore my sealed letter. He saw Markenmore give Carter a receipt for it, which Carter sent on to me by post. I have it in my pocket now. The head clerk says that as soon as Carter had gone, he saw Markenmore break the seals of my letter, draw 2 papers from it, and read them. Markenmore, the moment he had finished them, went into the telephone box in the hall of their building and presumably rang someone up. Within half an hour a man came who was an absolute stranger to the head clerk. He is positive that this man had never been there before, but he remembers him well, a foreigner by appearance, and can give you an accurate description of him. Now the clerk saw Markenmore produce my sealed letter, unsealed of course I mean, and show the strange man the 2 pages which it contained. A few minutes later they went out together. Now who is that man? You'll have to find him." The chief constable looked at Blick. "This," he said, "seems like shifting the scene of your operations." But Blick looked at the professor. "What description of this stranger did Markenmore's clerk give you?" he asked. "Dark, swarthy, middle-sized, middle-aged man, very well dressed," responded the professor promptly. "The sort of man," he said, "you see much of in financial circles. Some sort of a foreign Jew, in the clerk's opinion." "Had such a man come into these parts, he must have been seen," said Blick. "I've made minute inquiries about the recent presence of strangers at all the railway stations." "There are other ways of transport than railways," observed the professor. "But anyway, here's one thing certain. Markenmore showed the formula and my opinion on it to this man." Blick walked about the room a while, in his favorite attitude, head down and hands in pockets. He turned at last to the chief constable. "Well, I'm going back to Markenmore," he said. "There are certain things to see there. Afterwards—" "We must have more talk," responded the chief constable. "As you say, afterwards." The professor rose and picked up his hat and walking stick. "I am going to stay at the Mitre here for a day or 2, he said. "So if you want me, you'll know where to find me. But while I am here, I should like to see the scene of all this mystery. And if you're going out there, Sergeant, I'll go with you, if I may." "Great pleasure, sir," replied Blick. He took the professor out and through the streets of Cellcaster to the long straight road that led towards Markenmore. As they walked along, he detailed to him the whole of his own proceedings, from the finding of the dead man to the affairs of that morning with Mrs. Braxfield. "Whether the offering of a reward will do any good, I don't know," he said in conclusion. "If anybody has seen such a stranger as you indicate, it might. But I'm sure I should have heard of that before now." "Ah, you'll have to go back on your trail. You'll have to go back on your trail," said the professor. "The secret lies away back. I'm convinced. All the theories are wrong so far. It's not money, at least not ready money. It's the Spindler formula, with its vast potentialities. Now what does this Mrs. Braxfield propose to offer for information?" "Don't know. She didn't say," answered Blick. "But we soon shall know. Look there." A bill poster's cart, driven by a man in white linen overalls, passed them, going rapidly in the direction of the village. "Her solicitor spoke of having these things out at once," continued Blick. "He's evidently lost no time. That chap's going out to post them." "Small result, I fear," said the professor. "My own opinion is that the whole thing was too carefully engineered. Nothing would come out here." "You never know," replied Blick. "All sorts of things help." They walked on to the entrance to the village. There, at the first blank wall he had come across, the bill poster was already busy, a group of open-mouthed women and children around him. The two men stopped as the bill, a big square sheet in heavy black lettering, was pasted, wet and shining, on the wall. The professor, adjusting his monocle, read it aloud. £100 reward. Whereas Guy Markenmore, Esquire, late of Markenmore Court, near Cellcaster, was found shot dead on the downs near Markenmore Hollow on the morning of Tuesday, April the 24th last, and is believed to have been murdered. Take notice that the above-mentioned sum, £100 sterling, will be paid to any person giving information which will lead to the arrest and conviction of the murderer. Such information may be given to the police or direct to Gilbert Crewe, Solicitor, Cellcaster. Remarked the professor, turning away with something of a sardonic smile. "Your Mrs. What's-her-name Braxfield doesn't err on the side of generosity. Now, if she'd said 500, eh?" "Mrs. Braxfield," said Blick, with a glance at the folk who were eagerly spelling out the contents of the poster, "observed cynically to the chief constable and me that there wasn't a man or woman in Markenmore who wouldn't give his or her own mother away for a £5 note. Now there are 20 5s in 100, so 20 times the inducement," laughed the professor. "Good arithmetic, anyway. Ah, well, my friend, I don't think this will do much good. But as a curiosity, I should like a copy of that bill. Do you think our worthy of the paste pot and brush would give us one?" "Nothing would please him better, I should think," said Blick, "especially if you give him the price of a pint of ale. Bill posting, I believe, is considered to be thirsty work." The professor laughed again, and approaching the bill poster, appropriated a couple of his bills and handed him half a crown. "Going to stick these things up all over the countryside, I suppose?" he asked, as he handed one bill to Blick and folded up the other for his pocket. "Mean to create a widespread interest, eh?" "Something of that sort, sir," answered the bill poster. "Such was my instructions. 200 copies of that poster I have in my cart, and up they go before dinner time, all round this here village. And," he added with a wink, "a fat lot of good they'll do, in my opinion." No good, you think? Suggested the professor. Why not?
"'Cause that there affair's darned sight too deep down in mystery," said the bill poster. "Deep, deep, deep, gentlemen. A deed of darkness, and ain't going to be found out in a hurry. But business is business, and I must go on with mine,
which at present is to excite everybody and arouse cupidity and avaricious feelings." "How humorous," observed the professor, as the bill poster hurried away. He walked on into the village at Blick's side, looking about him with inquisitive eyes. Suddenly he caught sight of the scepter. "Ah," he said, "so that's the inn where the midnight meeting took place. I should like to look in there. I wonder if they could give us some lunch." "I'm staying there," replied Blick. "My headquarters. And I've a private sitting room. If you'll honor me, sir, I'll order lunch whenever you like. They're well provided." The professor professed himself delighted, and for the next hour or two he and Blick, over the luncheon table and round the fire, discussed the Markenmore problem in all its ramifications. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon they went out to examine the scene of the drama, with Markenmore Hollow as a final objective. But as they strolled along the road, Blick suddenly caught sight of Daffy Hallowell, just within the wicket gate of the Dower House, and he saw too that Daffy quietly signaled her desire to speak with him. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of the Markenmore Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Man Who Could Guess. As she made her signaling movement towards Blick, Daffy retreated a pace or two within the thick shrubbery, and the expression in her eyes indicated a desire for secrecy and caution. Blick, in his turn, signed to his companion to follow him, and whispered an aside as they left the road and passed through the wicket gate. "This is one of the women I told you of," he murmured. "Mrs. Tretherow's maid, Daphne Hallowell, sister of the girl Myra Hallowell, who married Guy Markenmore. She's therefore aunt to the new baronet. And as deep as they make 'em. Come with me. I'll let her think you're an assistant of mine." "Excellent," said the professor. "An adventure. By all means, my dear fellow. The lady looks as if she had something to impart." "I shouldn't wonder," answered Blick. "As I say, she's deep." Daffy had retreated further up the walk between the laurel and holly bushes. She now stood awaiting their approach, and as they drew near, she looked closely at the professor, and especially at his fashionable attire. Her eyes glanced a question at Blick. "All right," whispered Blick. "Professional friend of mine. What is it?" "I want to speak to you," said Daffy. She looked round at their surroundings, and then at a narrower path which opened close by. "Come along here," she went on. "There's an old summer house down there that's never used. We shall be safe there." The two men followed Daffy's trim figure through a maze of shrubs until they came to a rustic arbor set in the midst of high trees. Entering this, a dilapidated and moldy place, she turned and confronted Blick, with another side glance at the professor. "I wanted to speak to you, Mr. Blick," she said in low tones. "I'd been waiting there at the gate some little time, thinking I might see you coming out of the Scepter. My mistress has driven into Selcaster, so I shan't be wanted, and nobody's likely to come here. So we're safe enough for a bit of talk. Look here, there's a reward out, isn't there?" £100, assented Blick, watching her narrowly. Daffy made a grimace. "Oh, well," she said, "it's a miserable amount, but I don't want it, and I don't know anything that would enable me to get it. But, now, this is between ourselves, isn't it?" "Absolutely," declared Blick. "Strictly so. Tell us anything you like, and can." "Well, I know of somebody who I believe has made a pretty good guess at the truth about Guy Markenmore," answered Daffy. "And he's a man who'd be glad of £100, for he wants to emigrate." "What man?" asked Blick. Daffy lowered the tones of her voice. "Jim Roper," she whispered. "You've heard of him?" "Yes," replied Blick. He was already wondering how much of whatever was coming was to be relied on. As far as he had seen into her character, Daffy did not seem the sort of woman to tell anything that would not benefit herself. But she might have reasons for benefiting Jim Roper, which was not yet apparent. "Yes," he repeated, "I've heard of Jim Roper. He's the man who wanted to marry your sister Myra, isn't he? The sister who ran away with and married Guy Markenmore?" "That's just it," assented Daffy. "It's because he was about to marry Myra when she threw him clean over and went off with Guy Markenmore that Roper hasn't spoken, but £100 might induce him to speak." "What do you mean, exactly, about it's because of that?" asked Blick. "And what is it that he hasn't spoken of?" "Well," replied Daffy, with a glance that took in both men, "it's like this. Roper is, and always was, what you'd call a dark-tempered man. The sort that never forgets nor forgives. He'd always meant to marry Myra, and she'd promised him, too. In fact, they were just about to have the banns published when she suddenly ran away with Guy. And, of course, nobody, not even me, her own sister, ever knew what had become of her until recently, when all this business came out about their having got married. Roper, when she first went off, went many a time to London to look for her. He never got a trace of her, of course, but he always swore that it was Guy Markenmore who'd enticed her away. And he swore something else, too, that if ever he chanced to cross Guy Markenmore, he'd kill him, if he swung for it there and then. He meant it, too. That was about the last thing he said to me just before I went to India with Mrs. Tretherick, and it was the first thing I heard him say when I came back here 7 years later." "Still meaning to do it, after 7 years?" said Blick. "I believe he'd done it if he'd met Guy Markenmore after 17 years, replied Daffy. "He's that sort. I could see he'd got worse with brooding over it. It was the one thing on his mind. Why, it's only a fortnight ago that I met him hereabouts one day, and happened to mention that old Sir Anthony was on his last legs, and that I'd wondered if Guy would come back and be master. And he scowled and said that if Guy ever came back, it would be only to get a knife through him. And I'll tell you, since it is between ourselves, that when I heard that Guy had been murdered, I fully believed that Roper had met him that morning and done for him. I really did." "And you don't believe it now?" suggested Blick. "No," asserted Daffy, "but I believe Roper has a very good idea as to who did murder him. In fact, he may have more than an idea. He may know. And I tell you that he may be inclined to tell you for £100, for now that he knows Myra is dead, he wants to leave here and go abroad." "What makes you think that Roper knows something?" inquired Blick. "Let's have it straight out now. Has he said anything to you?" "Yes," replied Daffy. "I met him a night or two ago when he'd come down to the village to do his shopping. We got talking by that gate where you met me just now. And, of course, it was all about the murder. I asked him straight out if he'd had anything to do with it. He said no, worse luck, he hadn't. And then he said more. I could tell something about it, he said, but I ain't going to, for the thing's done now. I ain't going to help the police, he went on. Let 'em do their own work. That was all. He went off then. Giving you no more idea than just that? Asked Blick. He said nothing but that, replied Daffy. But I'm sure he knows something. Only if you begin questioning him, for God's sakes, don't let him know I told you. I can get over that easily if you'll just tell me this, said Blick reassuringly. Did Roper make threats against Guy Markenmore in anybody's presence beside your own? In the old days, I mean? Oh, he certainly did, in the old days, before I went to India, asserted Daffy. I've heard of him saying dreadful things at the Scepter. I should think there's many a man in the village who's heard him. Blick's memory went back to the first conversation he had overheard at the Scepter, and to the remarks of certain of the village men as to the feelings of enmity cherished by various unnamed persons of the neighborhood against Guy Markenmore. All right, he said, your name shan't come in. I've heard something of Roper's threats and feelings elsewhere. But now, where does Roper live? All by himself in a cottage amongst the woods on the other side of the downs, behind Markenmore Hollow, replied Daffy. He keeps himself to himself up there, never comes down this way, except once a week to buy his groceries and meat. What sort of man is he? Asked Blick. He used to be as nice a lad as there was anywhere about, till Meyer ran away, answered Daffy, but that soured him. He's a black, gloomy, quiet man now, scarcely speaks, and never smiles. I don't know if you'll get anything out of him or not, but I'm perfectly certain he either knows something or has guessed at something. You're quite sure in your own mind that Roper himself is innocent? Suggested Blick, looking searchingly at her. Daffy Hollowell glanced at both men and uttered a queer laugh. Yes, she exclaimed, I'm certain of that. Why now? Asked the professor, speaking for the first time since the beginning of the conversation. Why are you certain? Daffy turned her regard more particularly to the second questioner. After looking carefully at him for a full minute, she spoke. You look as if you'd understand, whoever you are, she said suddenly. And that you're a policeman, plain clothes or otherwise, I don't believe. I'm certain Jim Roper didn't kill Guy Markenmore, because if he had, he's just the man to have let it be known that he'd had his revenge. He wouldn't have cared twopence if they had hanged him next day. Blick exchanged another word or two with Daffy as to Roper's exact location, and he and his companion went off. The professor marched along in silence for a while. That woman possesses a power of keen insight into character, he remarked at last. She'd make a useful member of your force, Blick. I'm sure she's quite right in what she said just now. A man of the sort she described, who'd nursed his desire for revenge all these years, wouldn't care very much who knew that he'd satisfied it at last. For him, you see, it would be the end. All else would be nothing. What about self-preservation? Suggested Blick. I don't think he'd be at all careful about that, replied the professor thoughtfully. No, the woman's intuition is right. I think we must acquit this man Roper. A much wronged man, too, evidently. I'm curious to see him. I dare say we shall soon find him, said Blick. He'll be somewhere in the woods. He led his companion up Deep Lane, past the Warren and Woodland Cottage, to the summit of the high ground above Markenmore Hollow. Beyond that point Blick had never been. He was surprised to find himself contemplating a stretch of country which in its wildness and diversity contrasted strongly with the pastoral and landscape country that he and his companion had just left behind them. Here, on the northern side of the uplands, the hillsides were broken into deep, dark combes and ravines. Great masses of rock jutted out from the slopes. Old, dark, apparently impenetrable woods were on all sides. The two men looked round in astonishment at the almost savage character of the scene. Observed that as far as they could see there was not a human habitation in sight. "A wild scene," remarked the professor. "Deserted." But Blick lifted a hand. "Hark!" he said. From somewhere to the right of where they stood came the unmistakable ring of an axe, laid with vigor to the root of some tree. Turning in that direction, they saw the tall, slender spire of a pine sway, totter, and disappear amongst the lower trees, amidst which it had stood. A dull crash followed. "That'll be our man at work," said Blick. Silently the two men crossed the hillside, in the direction whence the sound of the swinging axe, now evidently laid aside, had proceeded. Within a few minutes they reached a belt of trees, through an opening in which they saw a clearing in the wood beyond. There beside the fallen pine stood a man at that moment in the act of lighting his short clay pipe. His axe lay against the tree which it had just felled. Near it a dog was curled up against its master's coat. It cocked an ear and opened an eye as the two strangers drew near. At its low growl the man turned and gave his visitors a sullen, questioning glance. "A formidable-looking fellow," murmured the professor. "And that axe of his is a fearsome weapon, Blick. I should speak to him very fair, to begin with." Blick smiled. "I shan't frighten him," he answered. "Persuasion goes further than force. Good afternoon," he continued pleasantly as they came nearer the object of their search. "Are you James Roper?" "My name, mister," replied the woodman. "That's mine," said Blick, producing one of his professional cards. "You may have heard of me. I'm staying at the Scepter." Roper took the card, glanced at it and at Blick, and handed it back unconcernedly. "Heard something of the sort," he answered. Blick sat down on the fallen pine and pulled out his pipe and tobacco. "I wanted to know if you couldn't give me a bit of information, Roper," he said. "You live hereabouts, don't you?" "Close by," replied Roper in tones which signified that it was none of Blick's business where he lived. "Then you know this district, these woods, and hillsides, and downs, very well indeed, I should think," continued Blick. "Out on them and amongst them early in the morning, and perhaps late at night, no doubt?" Roper made no answer. He had got his pipe fairly going by that time, and he now picked up his axe and began to lop away the upper twigs and slighter branches of the tree on which Blick had seated himself. Blick assented to his silence and kept his own. The axe ceased, and Roper, leaning on its shaft, looked at his questioner. "You ain't come here for nothing," he said with a scowl. "What might you be after?" "I do hear as how you're inquiring into that there affair at the Markenmore Hollow. I don't know nothing about it. Might strike ye that if I did I'd come somewheres your way or to the police at Selcaster and it told." "And it might strike me that you wouldn't," retorted Blick, with a sly glance at his man. "I've learnt a good deal since I came into these parts. You'd a pretty good grudge against Guy Markenmore yourself, eh?" Roper scowled more darkly than before. "Don't know nothing certain about how he come by his end, anyhow," he muttered. "And as to grudges, there's them around here as knows how that varmint treated I. Ain't a decent man, same as what I've been, a right to have his feelings about another man as treated him bad?" "You've the same right to your feelings that every other man has," agreed Blick. "Who says you haven't?" Roper looked somewhat mollified. "Well," he replied slowly, "'cause of such feelings as I do have, I wouldn't have lifted a finger to preserve that man. He got what such like deserves, but I ain't no what you might call certain idea whatever who he got it from." "You mean, if it comes to precise particulars," insinuated Blick. "But now look here, Roper. You knock about a good deal round this part, early and late, and I guess you've a pair of sharp eyes and a pair of sharp ears as well. Guy Markenmore's dead. Good riddance to him, if you like. I don't care, I'm sure. But what's it matter if you have any knowledge of any sort about him, just before his death, if you let it out, especially if it's made worth your while? For instance, in going about as you do, have you ever seen anything suspicious, or met any suspicious characters? Have you ever heard or seen anything out of the common?" Roper looked from one visitor to another. The professor, smoking a cigar, was watching him attentively. "Ain't heard nothing about its being worth anybody's while to tell anything as they might chance to know," said Roper suddenly. Blick silently drew out his copy of the reward bill and handed it to the woodman. The professor, keenly attentive, saw Roper's eyes brighten at the sight of the heavy type in which the particulars of Mrs. Braxfield's reward were printed. He drew his heavy brows together as he laboriously read through the offer. "How does that strike you?" asked Blick presently. "There's £100 to be picked up by anybody who can tell a bit. If you know anything, mind, Roper, I'm not implying that you do, but if you do, Roper began to fold up the reward bill. His eyes were fixed thoughtfully on the trees in front of him as he handed the paper back to the detective. "Keep it," said Blick. "It's posted all over the place. If you do chance to know anything at all, Roper, cut in first." "That there money, £100, said Roper slowly. "Is it a sure thing?" "I'll guarantee that," answered Blick. "Dead certain, to anybody who can give accurate information. Have you got any?" "Money down?" asked Roper. "Money down," assented Blick. "Spot cash." Roper's pipe had gone out. He suddenly seated himself on a fallen tree and proceeded to relight the tobacco with a deliberation which showed that he was being equally deliberate in his thoughts. "I could do with £100, he said suddenly. "'Tain't a great deal, surely, but it'd do me a good turn. I'm sick and weary of these parts now, and I want to be off. I want to start a new life, somewheres far away. That man, Guy Markenmore, he broke my life in two, as you might say, and now, well, if I've the money, I'd go right away out of this, and see new places and faces, and try if I can't forget. I've lived overmuch alone, and—" Blick had not been prepared for this outburst of feeling, nor was he prepared for an equally sudden, wholly impulsive, similar display from the professor. "Look here, my man," he exclaimed. "You don't know me. Never mind. Blick here does. Now then, if you want a new start, another life, I'll give you £100 in addition to this reward money. Great pleasure, I'm sure, and just now. But if you know anything, tell." Roper stared in amazement at the professor, who nodded his head vigorously. "Thank ye, sir," he said suddenly. "I see you means it. You're a man with a bit of heart in you. Well, I don't know nothing positive, but I can make a pretty good guess at something." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of the Markenmore Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Devil's Grip. The professor, leaning forward on his walking cane, and the detective, watching the woodman with a sharp side glance, alike felt that they were on the verge of a revelation. But Blick's brain was busy with a queer, confused doubt. Roper talked of guesswork, and it was not guesswork that Blick wanted. He was wondering what Roper meant by guesswork, and yet, for all they knew, they might at that instant be within tangible distance of the much-wanted truth. "Well," he said. "Well, what is it?" "Seems little enough when you come to tell of it, like, and I'm no great hand," replied Roper. "But this here, last Monday night, it was, night afore Guy Markenmore was found, beyond there, at Markenmore Hollow. That night, after I'd had my supper, I left my cottage to walk to Mitbourne. There was a man there as I wanted to see. I took up the hillside, just behind Woodland Cottage, and struck into that grass track that run atop of the downs from thereabouts to near Mitbourne Station. And I might have been about a mile or so along that when I hears men a-comin' towards me." "What time was that, Roper?" interrupted Blick. "It'd be about 8:15, and nicely dark. Now, I'd reasons of my own for not wanting to be seen going Mitbourne way, so when I hears they men a-comin' along, I slips behind a big clump of gorse that was handy and stands still. Blimey, these two comes walking closer. I seen 'em outlined against the gray of the sky over Selcaster way, do you see? One tall man, one shortish man. A few yards away, the tallish man pulls up and lights a cigar. I see his face in the light of the match. Then you might 'a' knocked me down with a feather, for 'twas the man I hadn't never stopped thinking about for 7 bitter years. And you may reckon who that was, Guy Markenmore. I seen him so well, just for a minute, as I do see you. No mistaking of him, for there wasn't as much alteration in his face, damn him, as what I do allow he'd had seen in mine. There he was, and if it hadn't been for the t'other with him, I'd 'a' gone for him there and then, but I didn't. They come on, talking. They hadn't never stopped talking since I first seen 'em." "Hear what they said?" asked Blick. "Not to remember. Only words here and there, until they come right opposite me. Then, as they walks past, I hears something distinct enough. Guy Markenmore, he say it, 'I shall be coming along here about 4 o'clock in the morning to catch the 4-something from Mitbourne for Farsham,' he say, and then he laughs. 'You'll be safe and snoring in your bed,' he say, 'at that time, no doubt.' 'Don't you be too sure,' say the little fellow. 'I'm as early a bird as there is when I'm in the country.' Then they go on, Markenmore way, and I see 'em disappears round the corner of a spinney that stands about there, and then—" "A moment, Roper," interrupted Blick. "The second man, the littlest chap you describe, did he talk like a countryman? Like anybody about here, you know?" "No," replied Roper with emphasis. "Not he. London way o' talking his. Wasn't nobody belonging to these here parts, I know. I been in London to my sorrow. A Londoner I set he down for." "You didn't see his face?" "I didn't see nothing of him, 'cept his figure like. He stand away, as it were, out of the light when Guy was a-lighting his cigar. So I didn't catch nothing of his looks, but he was a littleish, broadish chap. To be sure, I didn't take no great notice of he, 'cause I was wishing he wasn't there at all." "Well, what then?" asked Blick. "Then I goes on to Mitbourne, and do my business with the man as I wanted to see," said Roper. "And when that was done, I had a pint of ale with him at the Cock and Pie, and so come home again." "Aye," remarked Blick. "Just so. And," he paused and gave Roper a particularly knowing look. "Anything else?" he asked. "I ain't a-going to keep nothing back," said Roper. "There is something else. Don't ye forget as how I've been keeping my feelings warm for Guy Markenmore for 7 years. A man's what's been wronged as I had, he don't forget easy, and when I gets to my cottage all alone that night after I come in from Mitbourne, I sat a-thinking, and I did remember, 'cause I hadn't forgotten, what Guy say to that chap he was with about being on that footpath to Mitbourne at 4 o'clock next morning. So I gets up at 3 o'clock and sets off to meet him, intending, if I did find him up there, to have it out with he, once for all." "Did you find him?" asked Blick quietly. Roper glanced from the detective to the professor. "Aye," he answered equally quietly. "I found him. But there'd been somebody there before me. He was warm then, but dead enough, with a bullet through the brain." The professor gave a little sigh, but Blick showed no sign of surprise, and his voice, when he spoke, was more matter-of-fact than ever. "It had happened then, just before you got there?" he said. "See anybody about?" Roper shook his head. "When I found him," he replied, "I made out as how he'd shoot hisself, but I looked close and sharp all about him, and I see there wasn't no weapon, no pistol, revolver, nothing of that sort. Then I looks all around. I see nobody. It was gray morning, and you couldn't see very far. There was mists among the spinneys and coppices, and curling along the tops of the downs. No, I see nobody, 'ceptin' hisself, dead." "Did you touch him?" inquired Blick suddenly. A curious dark look came over the woodman's face, and now he looked, not at the detective, but at the professor, as if he felt that in him he was secure of a certain sympathy and understanding. "It's a queer thing," he muttered, "but a minute before I come across him, there's nothing I could 'a' liked better than to lay hands on he. I had him by the throat and shook the life out of him, same as that there dog 'ud shake it out of a rat. But when I see him lying there at my feet dead and gone, I felt as if I couldn't bide to touch a hand to his body. He was dead. And yet I did a thing, and it was through doing that I came to know that he was still warm." "Yes, yes," breathed the professor. "What now?" "I see a ring on his finger," answered Roper simply. "The sort of ring that the gypsies women do trade off on the lanes hereabouts. A thing of no value, you understand, but one that you'd notice. And it come on me, I don't know why, that my Myra had given it to him. And I pulled it off his finger, and I went away with it, leaving him there a-staring at the sky." The professor let out a long sigh, but Blick spoke. "What have you done with that ring, Roper?" he asked. "'Tis here," said Roper, putting 2 fingers in his waistcoat pocket. "'Tis in my mind that my poor lass gave it to he. Her was fond o' geewaws or of that sorts. Many's the time her'd been took in by they gypsy women, trading a bit of poor trash or that sort to her for good money. But it's in me to think 'twas hers, and I wasn't going to let he carry that to his grave." "Well, you were wrong," said Blick, with remorseless candor. "Mrs. Tretherick gave that ring to Guy Markenmore, and he gave Mrs. Tretherick another exactly like it. They bought them in an old curiosity shop on Portsmouth Hard. It was never Myra's." Roper looked fixedly at the detective. Blick nodded, and at that Roper, who had been turning the ring over in the palm of his hand, suddenly threw it on the ground before him with a gesture of dislike. I thought it meant be, he muttered, but since it isn't. Blick picked up the ring and rose to his feet. Now, Roper, he said, that's the whole truth? All I know, answered Roper. Can't say one word more, master. You'll stand by it? Demanded Blick. Stand by every word I've said, affirmed Roper. It comes to this, continued the detective, turning to the professor. We've heard now of a man who was in Guy Markenmore's company the evening before the murder, and who knew that Guy would be on the downs at 4 o'clock next morning. Who is that man? Probably the man his clerk told me about, answered the professor. That's my opinion, anyway. Well, let's be going, said Blick. I'll see you again, Roper. You've no doubt put us on the track of something. But the professor lingered. Look here, my man, he said, turning to the woodman. You know the Mitre Hotel at Selcaster. Very good, I'm staying there. Come and see me there tonight. There's my card. Ask for me. If you want to emigrate, I'll find you the money. Tonight, mind, any time you like after 8 o'clock. He nudged Blick's elbow and hurried him away out of the wood before Roper could thank him, walking at a great pace until he and his companion were once more on the hillside. There's a man into whose soul the iron has entered, my friend, he said. Poor fellow, poor fellow. I felt deeply and sincerely sorry for him. 7 years lonely brooding over his love affair. Terrible. I fear you have a very deep vein of sentiment, sir, observed Blick. I'm sorry for the chap, too. He evidently took Myra's defection pretty badly to heart. But I'll tell you what I think, Professor. I think Master Roper ought to be feeling very thankful that I didn't request him to march down to Selcaster police station with me. If I were not a believer in psychology as a science, I should certainly have desired his presence there. But I sized him up and watched him closely, and I think I understand his curious mental processes. And I believe he told us the truth. I only wish he'd come and confide in me a week since. Do you know, I rather think that I should have done precisely what he did, had I been in his case, remarked the professor, ingenuously. I sympathized with the unhappy man all through. But now, my dear fellow, this mysterious person, how are you going to get on his trail? The queer thing about it, observed Blick, is this, at least. It's a surface difficulty. Taking Roper's story to be true, as I do, here's a strange man, a Londoner by his speech, says Roper, by which he probably means a man of the educated classes, on the downs with Guy Markenmore, late on Monday evening. Who is he? Did he come down with Markenmore from London? Did they meet in the train? Did they foregather on the way between Mitbourne and Markenmore? We don't know, but there are more important questions than any of these. For one, where was that man going? Where did he go when he and Markenmore parted? For another, and a third and most important one, if he's the man who shot Guy Markenmore next morning, where had he been in the meantime? Where did he spend Monday night? It couldn't have been far away from hereabouts, if he laid in wait for his victim at 4 o'clock next morning. Puzzling, admitted the professor. Yet I suppose that a man who had much at stake wouldn't mind sticking it out in these woods for a few hours. The nights are warm now, and there's a lot of shelter here in these valleys. Now what amazes me is, if this man murdered Guy Markenmore, as I'm sure he did, why didn't he murder him on Monday night and get away in the darkness? Blick laughed. I'll tell you why, he answered. He was a man whom Guy Markenmore had taken into his confidence about this dye affair. He had come down with him, fully acquainted with what Guy was doing. He knew that the money business was likely to be settled that night, and he waited until morning so that he could possess himself of the cash as well as the formula you have told us of, with your opinion attached to it. Probably he is the man of whom Markenmore's clerk at Fulgrave Court told you, and we'll have to try and find him. But the clue's thin and poor, so far." The professor nodded, paused, and looked about him. While talking, they had strolled slowly along the hillside into a still wilder stretch of country. They were now standing on the edge of a deep ravine, which cut into the land beneath to a depth of some 200 feet. Here and there the fall was precipitous. In the dark and gloomy recesses far below, great masses of yew and pine were broken by huge blocks of gray limestone. Over everything hovered a somber and mysterious silence. But suddenly the professor broke it. "There's someone signaling to us," he exclaimed. "Down there, a woman." Blick looked in the direction indicated and started in surprise. Far away below them, a little to their right, he saw a woman's figure standing near a grove of trees which lay at the foot of the most precipitous part of the ravine. And as the professor said, she was certainly endeavoring to attract their attention. "Good heavens!" he said. "That's Miss Valencia Markenmore. Whatever is she doing down there? Do you know what they call this place? The Devil's Grip. Grip, I suppose, means a sharp cut in the surface of the land. But what can she want?" "Let us make our way down," suggested the professor. "We are evidently wanted. Hello! There are men, too." Two figures had just emerged from amongst the cluster of pine trees near which Valencia stood. Blick suddenly recognized them as those of Harborough and Mr. Fronsonmerry. They, recognizing the detective, also began signaling to him. "There's something afoot down there," he muttered. "Looks to me as if they made some discovery. Look here, sir. That tall man is Harborough, who, as I told you, was accused of the murder by Mrs. Tretherick. The other is Mr. Fronsonmerry, the old gentleman who has figured in this case." "I know Fronsonmerry by name," replied the professor. "He's a member of an archaeology society to which I also belong. I've corresponded with him. Now how can we get down there without breaking our neck?" "There'll be a sheep track somewhere along here," said Blick. "Where a sheep can go, we can, at a pinch." But some minutes passed before they found a means of descending into the depths of the ravine, wherein the others there awaited their coming. Once in its recesses, the professor wondered at the precipice-like character of the cliff down which they had made their way, above the spot at which Valencia and her two companions were standing. The granite walls rose high and cliff-like. At one place there was a sheer drop of 200 feet, terminating in a wild and broken mass of rock and shrub. It was at the lower edge of this wilderness that the three stood, looking alternately into its recesses and at the men hurrying along the level floor of the ravine towards them. At Mr. Fronsonmerry's heels, held in a leash made out of his master's handkerchief, the Airedale terrier fretted and whimpered, evidently desirous of once more penetrating into the gorse bushes from whence he had been unceremoniously dragged. "That's Fronsonmerry's dog, the chap that unearthed the automatic pistol," said Blick. "I wonder if he's made another discovery." Harborough came slowly towards them. As he approached, he gave Blick a warning look and pointed to the pine trees. "I say," he said in a hushed voice, as they drew near, "there's a man lying dead in there. He must have fallen over the cliff. The terrier found him. We couldn't get him away, so I went in for him and saw this man dead, I say. Come and see." They were up to the other two by that time, and Blick, without further question or any ceremony, plunged in amongst the trees, followed by the three men. "Where is he? Who is he?" he asked. "Anybody you know?" "A stranger. Looks like a tourist," said Harborough. "Here at the foot of the rocks." He thrust and held aside the clinging branches of the pines and suddenly revealed the body of a man lying in a curiously twisted attitude across a mass of sharp-edged stone. One glance upward was sufficient to show what had befallen him. He had slipped from the edge of the precipice far above and crashed without a break on a place where he lay. A little distance from him lay the walking stick which he had dropped from his hand as he fell. With a sharp exclamation, Blick sprang forward and turned the face, hitherto crushed in amongst a cushion of moss and heather, to the light. He rose, staring at it. "Good God!" he said. "It's Crawley, the man I met." But a stronger, far more astonished exclamation came from the professor as he in his turn saw the dead man's face. "Crawley!" he said. "Crawley! Man alive! That's Carter! Carter! Carter, I tell you!" Blick felt as if an ice-cold wave of illumination had washed across his brain. He turned on the professor with searching eyes. "Carter!" he exclaimed. "Your assistant?" "My assistant." "The man who carried your sealed letter to Guy Markenmore?" "That very man," affirmed the professor solemnly. "Good Lord, what does all this mean?" Blick suddenly dropped on his knees by the dead man's side and abruptly plunged a hand into an inner pocket of the clothing, into a second, a third. Just as suddenly he produced a letter case, and from it drew out a wad of bank notes and 2 papers. He dropped the notes unconcernedly on the stones and hastily unfolded the papers. A second later he thrust these into the professor's hand. "That's what it means," he said quietly. "There's Spindler's formula. And there's your opinion about it. And this is the chap who killed Guy Markenmore." Then he looked round at the 3 men. The professor was staring blankly at the papers just handed to him. Mr. Fronsonmary was staring at the professor. Harborough, anxious and puzzled, was looking doubtfully at the dead man. It was he who spoke first, turning to the detective. "You think that he killed Guy Markenmore in order to get possession of those?" he asked in a low voice. Blick rose from his knees. "What else?" he said calmly. "I see the whole thing now. Sir Thomas there and I already know something of it, but up to a few minutes ago I didn't suspect this man. But as I say, now I see it clearly enough. This man, whom I met a few nights ago at the Scepter, posing as Crawley, a holiday maker, taking a walking tour round this country, is in reality Carter, an assistant of Sir Thomas's at his laboratory at Cambridge. It was he to whom Sir Thomas entrusted a sealed packet for direct conveyance to Guy Markenmore in London. He, Carter, was passing through London on his way here for his holiday. Now, although Carter did not know the nature of the precise contents of that packet, he had learnt from Sir Thomas that they were of immense scientific and monetary value. He was charged to put the packet into Guy Markenmore's own hands. He did so. Later that day Guy Markenmore traveled down here. So did Carter. Probably they met on the train. Probably they traveled in company. But at any rate, Sir Thomas and I have just found out that Guy Markenmore and Carter were together on these downs late that night, talking confidentially. Now, from what I've learned about him, Guy Markenmore was a talkative, free and easy sort of man, open and candid. Probably, knowing that Carter was Sir Thomas's assistant, Guy took Carter into his confidence about the secret. And Sir Thomas and I have just ascertained that Guy told Carter that he would be at or about Markenmore Hollow at a very early hour next morning. What does Carter do? He forms the plan of hanging about all night, a warm night, mind, waylaying Guy early in the morning and murdering him for the secret and for the money which was to be put together for it that night by Guy, Lansbury, and Baron von Echterstein, And he carries all this into execution. What does he do then? Goes quietly away amongst these hills and woods on his walking tour. Who's going to suspect an innocent-looking pedestrian? But, having in the meantime read the newspapers, he works round in his character of tourist to the Scepter, where I met him, and where I confess he thoroughly took me in. The murderer's old trick, you see, of hanging around the scene of his crime, full of a morbid curiosity to know what's been said and done. Nobody suspected this man in the slightest degree. I, myself, never dreamed of connecting him with this affair. He stayed his night at the Scepter and went away, crossing these downs. And here he met with this fatal accident. And if we hadn't found this, and those papers on him, I don't believe we should ever have known who it was that killed Guy Markenmore. But we know now." He stooped down and drew the dead man's soft cap more closely over his face. When he looked up again, the professor was still staring thoughtfully at the papers in his hands, and Mr. Fronsonberry, unusually grave, was watching him. But Harborough was already striding away through the trees toward Valencia. End of chapter 25. End of the Markenmore mystery. Recording by Richard and Sharon Kilmer, San Antonio, Texas.